All right, thanks for joining and thanks for looking this up. My name's Dr. Ben Allen from the University of Southern Queensland in Toowoomba, Australia, and I'm also a research associate with Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. And today I'm going to give a presentation on animal welfare and ethics principles for managing animal welfare and ethics conundrums. We often find ourselves as wildlife managers or conservationists, which is sort of my background, and people who participate in agriculture as well. I do a lot of wildlife management work in agricultural settings and livestock production settings in particular. We often find ourselves in all sorts of conundrums with animal welfare and animal ethics, and it can be a little confusing sometimes, and we can sometimes have a lot of competing voices or attitudes or opinions on how we should do a particular thing or whether or not we should do it at all. And so this presentation is intended to address some of that confusion and provide some sort of coherent framework so that people being bombarded with animal welfare and ethics issues are able to sort of articulate why they do some things and troubleshoot some of the problems or issues that they may face. So first up, I want to say that the work that I'll present or the things I'll talk about are not just my thoughts. It's the work of a lot of different people. Here's some of the papers and presentations that you can look up if you'd like more information on the things that we're talking about. And I'll particularly draw your attention to Jordan Hampton and Chris Bobbier. Jordan's at the University of Melbourne and Chris Bobbier is at St. Mary's University of Minnesota and is a philosopher. And between the three of us and a whole lot of others, we've really sort of brought together some of these concepts to put them into something that I hope is articulate and useful for a lot of people. So first of all, I want to set the scene. I can't talk about every animal welfare problem and every animal ethics problem around the world for every animal. So I just wanted to focus our attention at least a little bit on some of the key contexts that we'll talk about today. The first of which is my bread and butter, which is managing predation in livestock production settings. And there's a few photos here intended to highlight some of the welfare issues that are trying to be addressed. In this case, when it comes to predation, we're talking about dingo or wild dog predation on sheep and beef cattle. That sheep down the bottom right is alive and had to be euthanized, obviously. But we're talking about managing predation, or that's part of the context for animal ethics and welfare. Another context that we find ourselves in a lot is managing competition. This is competition for grass or fodder or space. And in this case, you've got a lot of kangaroos. They're on a livestock property that has sheep, goats, or cattle, and they're all trying to fight for the same blade of grass. Eventually, at some point, when you run out of blades of grass, we're going to have a welfare problem for sheep, cattle, and kangaroos, and all the other things, mind you. So competition itself might not be as gruesome as something like predation, but it still produces animal welfare and animal ethics issues. Another context that we might find ourselves in is managing really large animals. In this case, some of the largest, in Asian elephants, they're very difficult to handle just because of their size. So in a lot of Asian countries, they tie them up and they, most of their lives, spend standing on a dirt mound under a tin shed, unless they're working or on display or doing something else. And if you're observant here, you'll see in the top left-hand corner, a bull elephant that's not tied up. This is a wild elephant, a wild bull elephant that's come in to harass the sort of domesticated female elephants. And you don't want to get in between those two when they're having a barney with each other. But you've got essentially a female that's not just tied up all day, but is also restrained in the presence of a big, aggressive male elephant. And it causes welfare and ethical issues as well. And I'll give you one other one, which should be familiar to a lot of people, and that's intensive livestock industries, whether it's feedlots for cattle, pork, dairy, chicken, all sorts of intensive industries also present a lot of ethical and welfare issues, not necessarily bad ones, but just issues and things that need to be considered. So with these few things in mind, predation, competition, display and wild animal welfare, and then intensive livestock, with those things in mind, let's dig a little bit deeper into some of these issues. First thing to understand is that animal welfare and animal ethics are two very different things. We might think of them as the same or being related, or some people might try and force on us that they are the same or related, but welfare and ethics are two very, very different things. Animal welfare is or should be an objective and quantitative science, which sort of gets us to the question of how do we do a certain thing? If I need to perform a particular activity, how do I go about doing that? It's the quantitative nuts and bolts of how much a particular thing hurts or causes suffering or causes pain. And we may ask ourselves, what are the effects of our actions or inactions on individuals or populations? If I'm going to do a particular thing, how much does that hurt? How much suffering does that cause? Those are objective welfare-related questions. They should be data-driven and they should be evidence-based. At some point, we should be able to come up with a graph or a table or a statistic that says this thing hurts this much, or this thing causes so much stress, or this thing causes so much suffering. It should be quantitative. And if we do this stuff properly, science, when you do science properly, it should be indisputable and it should be unquestionable. And one example is tail docking, whether it be for dogs or whether it be for pigs. Another example might be trapping. Another example might be euthanasia. How do you go about doing this thing? If I have to dock a tail, do I cut it off with a saw a bit at a time without anesthetic? Or do I give them anesthetic and do it with a scalpel? Or is it with an axe on a block of wood? Or a machete over a fence post? Or obviously, we wouldn't want to be doing these sorts of things, but just as examples, we're talking about if we're going to do this particular activity, how do we do that activity? That's animal welfare. Animal ethics, being different, is a subjective or qualitative, quote unquote, science. It's more philosophical based. It's what we think we should do or we think we shouldn't do. To use the example of tail docking, animal ethics would say, should we dock this tail or not? Maybe the answer to that question is yes. Maybe the answer to that question is no. If we're going to dock it for whatever reason, then we move into the realm of animal welfare about how we do it. So animal ethics deals with the question of, is an action justified or justifiable? Should we or shouldn't we do this thing? Because of the nature of animal ethics being subjective, there is probably 8 billion views for every single person in the world on how you would do this thing. Different perspectives. People have different levels of tolerance or acceptability for some action. Some people are more than happy to have elephants tied up under a shed. Other people are not happy with that. That's an ethical position that people take. Importantly, there are different ethical systems or frameworks or philosophies, different ways of thinking about animal ethics. And we may not know it or may not think about it, but each of us will have some sort of ethical slant which will fit into a particular type of ethical category. Often when we see debates and people arguing with each other about whether or not we should do things, and the literature may show you people for and against particular activities, often what is fueling that debate is people are speaking different ethical languages. Somebody is coming from a position or one ethical position, and they're having an argument with somebody else who's coming from a different ethical position, and neither of them are getting through because they're talking different ethical languages, as it were. So one example of an animal ethics conundrum would be culling males, male chickens, male dairy cows. It's hard to get milk out of a male dairy cow, and it's hard to get an egg out of a male chicken. So people cull lots of male chickens and lots of male dairy cows. And so we may say, well, is that right? Is it right or wrong? Should we or shouldn't we be doing that? That is an ethical question. If we decide we are going to do that, then we move into the realm of animal welfare. So animal ethics and animal welfare are two very different things. It's important to know the difference and important to know which ethical background you're sort of coming from. So on that note, There's lots of different ones, but there's a handful here of the main ones or the primary ethical frameworks that people will be making positions from. And I'd encourage you to think carefully about where you sit with some of this stuff and where you sit on some particular, animal welfare or animal ethics issues. Now, we're not going to go through these in great detail for all of them. I'll leave it sit here for a minute. I'll go in reverse order because the first couple we'll deal with in a bit more detail in subsequent slides. But just to recap, or just to cover briefly what some of these mean, these different ethical frameworks or philosophies. Number 7, the one down the bottom, ethical particularism, essentially just means that everybody has their own view. There's no one way or right way or wrong way. People have their own particular individual view on whether or not something should happen. Now, when we talk about harming animals, or including killing animals, harming or killing them, eating them, trophy hunting, whatever it might be, if we're talking about causing harm to an animal, under the ethical particularism philosophy, the way you would justify that, justify harm, is by saying to yourself something like, causing pain requires some good reason. You need to have a good reason for doing it. So because there is a good reason to do it for various different purposes, it is therefore permissible. It's quite a straightforward argument, if you like, a straightforward justification. Care ethics is a little bit more complicated. It's number 6, second from the bottom. Care ethics essentially just means that in order for a particular issue to be eligible, if you like, for consideration, ethical consideration, you need to be in a care relationship with that animal. Now, a perfect example of this is pets. If you have a pet dog or a cat or some sort of pet, or you're a livestock owner, you have a relationship with that animal that then conveys or then requires some sort of responsibility or stewardship on your part to look after the welfare of that animal. So things that don't have, you aren't in a care relationship with, fall outside of that. So for argument's sake, if you have a pet dog, you would be responsible for vaccinating and looking after and feeding that dog, making sure that dog's okay. But you don't have a responsibility towards a wild dog. Same species, same animal, but you're not in a care relationship with that animal. So care ethics essentially says that you have strong moral obligations to animals that you have a relationship with. So because you don't have a relationship with all animals, like every bird, fish, and mammal that lives out in the wild, you do not have a strong moral obligation to all those animals. Therefore, it's morally permissible to kill or harm some of them. That's how care ethics works. Contractarianism, a little bit more difficult to explain, but essentially means that if you had the wool pulled over your eyes and nobody knew what we were talking about, and you were sort of coming from a position of ignorance, would you come up with some simple moral rules that would help make decisions without any pre-existing information? They call those contractors, people making these rules. So a contractor, somebody who can be in a position to make these rules, they're rational, selfish, ignorant of their place in the world, including their position and their reliance on animals. So given that, contractors should create rules that grant moral standing and strong protections to rational persons, rational beings. Because animals are not rational beings or rational persons, we would not pass any rules that would grant moral standing or moral strong protections to those beings. In other words, because they're not rational persons, rational beings, they're sort of off limits or ineligible to be considered morally. That's contractarianism. I've probably done a terrible job at explaining that, but that's a different sort of ethical system. Number 4, right in the middle, divine command theory or religious ethics. This is essentially people who believe in God or a deity. And it's kind of, again, kind of straightforward, a little bit like ethical particularism, which simply just says, if God says it's okay, then it's okay. What is morally permissible and impermissible is determined by God. God says that I can kill animals for meat. God says I can kill an invasive species to save a native one. God says I can, it's acceptable to sell an animal or have a pet. So because those things are okay from a religious point of view, it is therefore morally permissible. That's what divine command theory or religious ethics sort of proposes. Consequentialism, virtue ethics, and deontology, we'll talk a little bit now in more detail. In wildlife management circles and sort of conservation, biodiversity conservation circles, there's sort of a quote-unquote new approach. A lot of people have been talking recently about an approach called compassionate conservation. And if I'm being cynical, this is largely used as a stick to beat up people who are engaged in wildlife management or traditional sort of forms of management. But they're quite eloquent and quite sophisticated in the way they articulate their position. The first part of this sort of compassionate conservation, or a sort of compassionate view of things, they sort of propose these core principles, and people who are familiar with the Hippocratic Oath and other sort of things might recognize some of these. The first is do no harm. Don't do it. If it's going to hurt something, don't do it. That should be your first port of call. The second principle that they would predict, or that they would posit, is individuals matter. So it's not about saving a population from, saving a population of endangered seabirds from a feral cat that got onto the island. It doesn't matter that you're trying to save the population. The individual cat matters. So individuals matter. Inclusivity, they profess inclusivity. All animals are included here. The cane toad has just as much rights as the dolphin or the elephant. But if you dig deep into it, it doesn't really work like that. But at least they say that it's about inclusivity. And they have this idea of peaceful coexistence. Anybody who's worked in wildlife management or ecology realizes there's no such thing as a peaceful coexistence. You're not going to get the predator to sit quietly with the prey. But nevertheless, they try and propose that we should live peacefully. Now, all of these things, do no harm, individuals matter, inclusivity, peaceful coexistence, all of them basically boil down to, we don't want you to kill anything. It's quite as simple as that. Don't kill stuff. You're meant to not kill stuff. Everything should be non-lethal. If you can't make it lethal or non-lethal, we would prefer it if you did nothing at all. Just stay out of it altogether, is sort of what that boils down to in practice. Now, compassionate conservation is rooted in two different ethical systems. One is deontology and the other is virtue ethics. Now, to go back, virtue ethics talks about the morals of a person, whether a virtuous person would do this or not. So the description of this kind of ethical framework is whatever a virtuous person would do. What does virtue ethics say we should do? Whatever a virtuous person would do. So because a virtuous person cares about animals and they want to, encourage them to do well, you would naturally think, well, surely harm is inconsistent with encouraging animals to do well. But in the real world, sometimes to encourage animals to do well requires a little bit of harm to some other animal. And because human flourishing also requires animals to be killed, i.e., agriculture, we want to eat animals, a virtuous person should not be opposed to all forms of animal killing. Now, they may well be opposed or object to some forms, but you can't have a prescriptive thou shalt not ever kill tenet in virtue ethics. It doesn't work that way. In virtue ethics, there are strong moral arguments that would allow animals to be killed or harmed for some reason, if it's a virtuous reason. The second is deontology. That fits within this compassionate conservation approach. Most compassionate conservationists sort of simultaneously switch gears between the two. Deontology is about rights and duties. An animal may have particular rights. Humans have particular duties towards those animals or those beings with rights. So the rationale to impose harm or killing on these animals means that a being who lack a rational nature also lack moral standing and rights. So because beings who lack moral standing and rights may be permissibly killed, and animals that lack Animals lack rational nature, so because they lack, therefore animals lack moral standing and rights, therefore it is morally permissible to kill an animal. That's sort of the argument structured from 1 to 5. But it's important to remember that deontology or natural law is about rights and duties. It's not necessarily what's about virtuous or not. It's just about whether or not something has rights or duties, sort of dispassionate rights and duties. Virtue ethics is not about rights or duties, it's about virtue. Under deontology, this rights and duties framework, there are some couple of principles that would allow most forms of animal harm and killing. And this is called the mini-ride principle and the worse-off principle. The mini-ride principle really just means that the needs of the many override the needs of the few. So, of course, all animals might have rights. We don't want to harm them or kill them. They have a right to life, live without harm, that sort of thing. However, if push comes to shove, the needs of the many override the needs of the few. The second principle is what we call the worse-off principle. What that basically means is that a little bit of harm to a lot of animals is better than major harm to a few animals. Now, a good example of this, or how we get away with inflicting harm under a deontological or animal rights approach, would be vaccinations. We impose a little bit of harm, restraining them, poking a sharp needle in them. Maybe they're sick for a couple of days when they deal with the vaccination. Maybe there's a few that have side effects. But this little bit of harm to a lot of animals is better than not doing the vaccinations and having a relatively smaller number of animals suffer really bad welfare outcomes when a disease rips through. So we can make a case under a deontological or animal rights-based philosophy to harm animals under the worse-off principle. And we do this every day, routinely. Virtue ethics, I should go back. Mini-ride principle, a good example of that, how you would use that under a sort of rights-based approach. If I was to give a human example, let's say you have 50 underground miners trapped. There's been a landslide and there's 50 of them trapped underground. And to save these miners, it's going to require killing one of them. Well, under a deontological or rights-based approach, these people have rights. They have a right to life, all that sort of stuff. But the needs of the many override the needs of the few. It becomes morally justifiable under a deontological approach to kill one to save the 49. That's not to be confused with consequentialism, which we'll talk about later, but that's a deontological or rights-based approach using the mini-ride principle to justify that harm. Virtue ethics, how you would justify harm under that is that there are there are exceptions to moral rules. You may have a moral rule, which is, be honest. Everybody wants to be honest. Honesty is really important. But if you were a person living in Germany in the Second World War and you were hiding Jews in your basement, and the police came and said, "Are you hiding Jews in your basement?" The honest person would say yes, knowing full well that the Jews would then be killed. Or you would have to lie, in other words, not be virtuous, in order for those people to be saved. So there's an exception in that case where you would lie, an exception to the moral rule. This happens all the time in wildlife management or animal production. We may be motivated by compassion to minimize the harm in what we call a tragic or non-ideal situation. Things aren't perfect. So because they're not perfect, we have to sort of balance this out somehow. And we want to minimize the harm, obviously, that a virtuous person would do that. And to minimize harm, sometimes you will have to cause some harm. Now, it would be cruel to refrain from direct harm, knowing that doing so would create or allow more harm. So if there's a kangaroo hid on the side of the road with 2 broken legs and a couple of wedge-tailed eagles sitting in the nearby tree, you can look and tell exactly what's going to go down with that animal. If I walk past that kangaroo and keep driving, those wedge-tailed eagles are going to come down, tear that thing apart while he's alive, and the kangaroo is going to suffer a really bad outcome. Morally, under a virtue ethics approach, to refrain from killing that kangaroo is not moral. It would actually be cruel or callous. So I would get out a hammer or a stone or a knife or whatever you had and kill the kangaroo as swiftly and painlessly as you could. And that would be justifiable under a virtue ethics or compassionate approach. You're causing some harm, sure, but refraining from doing that would cause more harm or allow more harm to happen. And these sort of exceptions and principles come down to what we call tragic situations, non-ideal situations, which animal managers and wildlife managers find themselves in every day. Some people might convince you, some philosophers might try and say that these are not common situations. Maybe for humans, these situations might not be common, but when we're dealing with animals, these sorts of situations happen daily. We've talked about deontology, we've talked about virtue ethics, now we'll talk about consequentialism. This was the last of those 7 in that table. This is what most wildlife managers would probably fit into, even if they didn't know it. And what consequentialism really means is that it's the consequences that are most important. All of our animal ethics committees, if you work at a university or you have to deal with animal ethics committees are essentially making their judgments based on consequentialism. It's meant to be impartial towards the various species. It's kind of like a balance sheet or a tally or an equation, if you like, that's measuring the costs, the welfare costs versus the benefits. And in this case, again, to use some examples, a farmer might say, all right, I need to kill 10 dingoes in order to save 100 sheep. And it's not about compassion. It's not about rights or duties. It's not about religious. It's not about anything else. It's simply an equation that says it is better to kill 10 to save 90, to save 100 than it is to not kill 10 and lose 100 or lose 90. So consequentialism is really just about the consequences of the action. Now, if we're proposing or we want to do a particular thing, cull wild dogs, shoot feral cats, keep livestock in a feedlot, I don't know, tail dock, whatever sort of issue you might think of bringing up, like whatever sort of example, if the net benefits, we're talking about welfare benefits here, if the net welfare benefits are positive compared to the costs, then you would be justified in going down that road and doing that action. That's consequentialism. That's why wildlife managers are happy to control invasive species to protect vast populations of native species. That's why people who raise livestock control predators of livestock, because it's a far better consequences if you do it that way. But you can still make a case for controlling predators under deontology or virtue ethics or any of the others. All right. Now, we've talked about compassionate conservation, which you might remember is virtue-based or deontological and consequentialist. Just as an example, and I'll give a few examples here from now on, largely about controlling predators like controlling dingoes in sort of beef cattle country. What you find when you follow these principles through to their end point, where the rubber hits the road and you're actually making a decision on what to do, the decisions always end up in the same place. And that is that it's permissible to do it. So I can be a consequentialist and I could ask myself, what action minimizes the amount of harm? And I can say to myself, well, it's better to kill 10 dingoes if it's going to save 100 calves. Well, then it's morally permissible to do that. That's a consequentialist approach. If I'm not a consequentialist at all, but I'm a compassionate conservationist, I might say, how can I best show compassion to both of these? How would I be able to promote what they call the flourishing, or, promote them all to do well? You may find that exercising compassion does permit the killing of dingoes, providing that there's evidence for that, of course, and that the alternatives are not as good. So we get to the point where it's still okay to kill the dingoes. There are some caveats which will come up later, but the practical endpoint of almost all of these is the same, and that is you're allowed to do the thing. So what we find is that the disagreement between conservationists or people getting hammered for livestock production, or most of the sort of welfare and ethical issues raised in the media, most of the time this disagreement primarily concerns the effectiveness of a particular practice at minimizing the harm. It's not really about the ethics. It's really about the harm, the welfare, not the morals of those practices or the motivations of the people or your ethical philosophy. We might say it is or think it is or mistake it for being that, but it really boils down to what's going on with welfare and harm and disagreements over which one causes the least amount of harm. So we could go through a little flow chart and say to ourselves, all right, how do we deal with this? And here's our example again for managing predators in livestock country. In the first part of this flow chart, we're talking about ethics. We're saying to ourselves, do we need to do this activity at all? And the questions a land manager might ask themselves are my livestock experiencing real impacts? We've lost a whole bunch of calves. We want to blame it on the dogs. Is it really the dogs? Was it flies? Was it mismothering? Was it temperature? Is it really the dogs? So we've got to ask ourselves that question first. Are they getting real impacts? And are those impacts really caused by the predators? Now, if we can answer yes to that, it really is an impact and it really is caused by predators, well, then we're justified in doing some sort of predator control. When we look around at the various tools we have available to us, baits, traps, guns, whatever you might, fences, whatever you want to use, we need to ask ourselves, is the tool that we want to use capable of reducing that impact? If it is capable, we're now on solid ethical ground and we shift into the realm of welfare. If we don't have a tool that will fix the welfare problem, well, then we're not ethically justified in progressing. A good example of this, just off the side, is opportunistic shooting of dingoes out in cattle country. It's good sport. You see a dingo walking along the road, you pull the gun off the back shelf of the car and you shoot that dingo and you feel good that you've protected your cattle. But if that's not really doing anything for your cattle, just taking pot shots at dingoes or shooting a handful here and there, you're not really ethically justified in doing it on grounds that it's going to be good for your cattle. Maybe you're doing it for sport and it's just tradition and it's fun or some other reason. That might be fine. You may want to justify it under that, but you can't really justify it as a means of protecting livestock if it's not going to actually reduce the harm to livestock. But let's say you've got a tool. It is capable of reducing the harm and there really is harms to reduce. Well, now we move into the realm of welfare and we ask ourselves, is the tool, of all the tools that are available, is the tool that I want to use the least harmful of those to fix the problem? So if you're lucky enough to have options, you should be picking the one that's the least harmful. And then predator control is justified. If it's not, well, then you're not justified on welfare grounds. You might need to make a justification or a case on other grounds. To summarize that last little bit of discussion there, best practice principles then for sort of controlling predators in livestock country is that, number one, we need to using a less harmful tool that is ineffective is not ethically justified. So shooting the odd dingo out the window to protect my cattle in the middle of nowhere, which is not really effective, side note, is not ethically justified. Number two, using a more harmful tool when a similarly less effective harmful tool is available is not ethically justified either. So if you've got the choice of, say, two poisons and one poison produces a really, really bad death and one poison produces a really, really nice death, you want to be using the one that's got the nice death that produces the best sort of welfare outcome. So that is summarized in point 3, which is you need to use the least harmful tool of all the tools that are capable of mitigating the harm. Now, we'll shift gears a little bit and we'll talk about how we might troubleshoot some of these issues that arise. One example that comes up often in wildlife management is capturing animals. We use soft catch traps. Overseas, they call them gin traps, box traps, all sorts of traps. We want to capture an animal with a trap. And sometimes you get injuries associated with trapping, or you capture non-target animals. And so there will often be calls to say, we need to ban traps. You're not allowed to use them. We don't want you to use them, ostensibly on welfare grounds. And the solution to that from a lot of sort of activist type people is to say, ban the whole thing. Well, you may not need to ban the whole thing if you troubleshoot what the actual issue is. We might all be familiar with a common risk assessment approach. You see this all the time in OH&S settings in any sort of workplace. We can follow a similar sort of approach in troubleshooting animal welfare problems or perceived animal welfare problems as well. Now, this one here is an example of trapping. So let's say I'm going to use a soft catch trap, a jaw trap, and a dingo is going to stand in that trap and I'm going to catch him by the foot, and then I'm going to come along and dispatch him or euthanize him later. But I'm catching too many bandicoots or goannas, catching too many goannas, and I've got a problem. How do I fix that problem? Well, there's a lot of things to consider. The first is how I set that trap. Maybe it wasn't concealed properly. Maybe I'm using the wrong lure. Maybe I'm using blood or meat or something like that when instead I should be using urine, something that's less attractive to a goanna. Maybe it's my trap type. I need to switch out the different type of trap. Another consideration is where I set the trap. Do I set it in a national park, like in some big broad bushland area, or do I set it at the water trough or the hole in the fence where they're getting through, that macro site or that micro site? And maybe given the particular location, maybe I can just shift it a little bit to the left or the right and fix my non-target problem. We don't really have a trap on holes in fences because you get lots of animals using the hole in the fence. And so if I set a trap at a hole in a fence, I'll catch a wallaby or something like that, when really I want to catch the dog. So all I might need to do is shift the trap a little left or right of the hole, and I'll miss all my wallabies and still get my dog. We also might ask ourselves when to set and check the trap. If I'm worried about goannas, well, I do my trapping in winter, and then I'm not going to catch any goannas because they're hibernating. Or maybe I can fix my welfare problems, or if all my animals are dying in the trap, maybe I just need to check it more frequently. So if we break down the actual exercise here, trapping, and really identify where the problem's occurring, you can troubleshoot the welfare issue, switch it out for something else, and now you've fixed the welfare issue. Having said all of that, we've made an ethical justification for doing our things under various ethical systems. We've troubleshooted some of the welfare problems, and we're satisfied that we fixed them all, and now I'm ethically justified to go catch my dingoes, and I'm justified on welfare grounds to go catch my dingoes. Having said all of that, there are other considerations. It's not all about welfare. Sometimes it's about economics. Sometimes it's about social license. Sometimes we kill animals because our neighbours expect us to kill animals. Sometimes we don't kill them because we think it's better to promote the idea of not killing animals, to look like we're not harming things. Sometimes there's legal obligations to do these things, whether you want to or not. There's all sorts of reasons or considerations. Now, if you're doing something for an economic reason, then own that. Don't pretend it's an ethical, you're doing it for a welfare reason or an ethical reason. If it's not the best welfare and doesn't have good ethics, if you're doing it for some other reason, own it and say it's for that reason. Because if you pretend or try to justify it under a welfare reason or an ethical reason when it's really not the case, the naysayers that are out to get you will probably smell a rat, and you'll be embarrassed or not be able to justify your position. So if it is about welfare, make it justified under welfare. If it's not about welfare, then you may just need to own it and say that, well, I'm doing it for this reason. It's not about welfare. Key messages to come from this, all of the things we've talked about. Animal ethics and animal welfare are very different things. Ethics is about whether you should or shouldn't do a thing, whether it's right or wrong to do a thing. Animal welfare is about if you're going to do a thing or not going to do it, how much is that going to cause suffering or pain or whatever. So where ethics and welfare are very different. Animal harm or killing animals is justifiable under several ethical frameworks, including all the frameworks that are usually invoked to harass the people causing harm. It's quite straightforward, actually, to make a case under each of those ethical frameworks to be involved in some sort of animal harm, like agriculture or pest control or whatever. The practical endpoint, regardless of that previous point, the practical endpoint of most of these is the same, which is that it's permissible to do the activity, the harm-causing activity. You can find a way to justify that. And so because you get to that practical endpoint, you need to realize that it's better to focus on animal welfare and not ethics, because you can argue all day about ethics, and there's no winners in ethics. Who am I to tell someone in China or Afghanistan or Africa how they should do it? And who are they to tell me how I should do it? Ethics is just a never-ending argument. So because we can't, progress that much, and all of those sort of systems end up in the same place, we should concentrate more on the effectiveness, the welfare effectiveness of the things we do, not operational effectiveness, not whether or not I catch the most dingoes this way, but whether or not I reduce the most harm this way, or have the most welfare benefit this way. We can get there sometimes when we troubleshoot things properly, really dig deep into it. And what I didn't mention earlier was that there is often trade-offs between ethics and welfare. To use a sort of, again, dingo wild dog example, we might say, I don't want to use 1080 poison. I think it's bad welfare. I don't want to use it. I think I'm going to use a gun instead. I'm going to shoot them. A bullet in the head is much better than dying of 1080 poison. So we might say, all right, I want you to use from now on a gun. You need to shoot everything in the head. That's to improve welfare. But if shooting dingoes out the window in the head doesn't actually fix my welfare problem, the sheep and cattle that we saw in those first couple of slides, now I'm not ethically justified in doing it. We may have maximized welfare for the dingo, but we're not ethically justified in doing it because it's not going to fix my problem. You could swing the other way and say that we're going to maximize ethics and say, all right, I'm going to be so moral, I'm not going to harm a single dingo. I'm going to totally stay right out of it. And sit on my sort of moral high horse, maximize my ethics, but now I've minimized animal welfare because there's a whole lot of livestock that are going to get killed because of my inaction. So there's often this trade-off between good welfare and good ethics, if you like, and troubleshooting the welfare issues and understanding the ethical frameworks that we work within help us to balance those trade-offs in a way that gets us towards better animal welfare while the animals are alive, rather than worrying about should we or shouldn't kill them in the first place. So that's it for the presentation. I hope I've been clear. I hope I've stimulated some thought. I'd welcome any feedback or questions, and I'd encourage people to revisit the second slide that has the papers that talk about some of this stuff in more detail. Most of this is contained within those resources that you'll find there, some of which are also online. So thanks again for listening, and I look forward to continuing the discussion later.